Hi everyone, welcome to Miss Adams Teaches The Great Gatsby. In this video, we are going to be taking a look at the final chapter. So we're going to do a full analysis of language structure and form, having a last look at character and theme. I hope it is useful. If you do find it interesting, please do subscribe so that you can find out about all of the other videos that I am putting together for your study of English literature and language. Without further ado, let's get started. For the last time, let's do a quick plot summary for the final chapter. So the chapter begins with the kind of notion of the scandal that Gatsby's death and Wilson's death has caused. And we hear about aspects of the inquest, questioning of Myrtle's sister, and we get a little bit of a description of the kind of aftermath surrounding Gatsby's house, which we'll look at in a little bit. All this time, Nick Carraway is, of course, questioning where are the people that supposedly love or care for Gatsby. Notably, there is no response from Daisy on the telephone, and it turns out that she has disappeared off with Tom. He can't get hold of Maya Wolfsheim. There is no kind of sense of where they are, and actually all that is left in this house is Jay Gatsby's body in this great big sprawling mansion that now feels so empty. In the end, Nick does go off and goes down and sees Mayor Wolfsheim. And they have a conversation which is quite illuminating about how Wolfsheim and Gatsby became acquaintances and became business partners. We'll have a little look at that in a moment. We also get to meet Jay Gatsby's father, Henry Gatz, who comes up to the house and is sort of so proud of what his son has done, and he produces this little photo of the house that is really well worn, that suggests that actually, like, the love that is there for his son is quite massive, and actually vice versa, because we also discovered that Gatsby has also paid for him to have a house, and so all of that judgment that seemed to be there by James Gatz when he was a boy seems to have been set aside. Bleakly, we have the funeral, which no one attends with the exception of Nick, Gatsby's father, and interestingly, and we'll look at this bit, Owl Eyes from chapter 3, but we'll look at that in a little bit more detail. Before the end of the book, we do have a little kind of stop in to two characters where perhaps we need a little bit of closure. The first character is, of course, Jordan Baker, where we get to see the phone call that happens between Nick and Jordan vis-a-vis their relationship and their breakup, and that will take a little bit of looking at as well. And we also get one more run-in with Tom Buchanan, who Nick bumps into on the street. And yes, well, we'll have a little look at that moment as well. This chapter is really about Nick's decision to move back home, to leave this area because he feels so exhausted and horrified by everything that has happened. And of course, we will pay a little bit of close attention to the final passage of Gatsby, which is brilliant. So stick with me. Right. Let's start off by looking at the immediate aftermath, okay? So this is right at the very beginning of the chapter, and I've included this because I do think it is quite notable the way that similar patterns are repeating themselves. He remembers the rest of the day and the night and the next day as an endless drill of police and photographers and newspapermen in and out of Gatsby's front door. Okay, notice that syndetic listing. It feels really reminiscent of some of the descriptions of his earlier parties. So there's this sort of bitter irony here that the same amount of fuss is going on, but not by anyone that loves him. It's all by either investigators or people reporting on it. You also have the notion of little boys discovering that they could enter through Nick's yard, and there were always a few of them clustered open-mouthed about the pool. So again, we've got this kind of sense of awe and wonder, but it's morbid. It's not a true curiosity in a positive way. It's a morbid curiosity. You can also draw parallels between this bit and Myrtle's death as well, and I think actually looking at Gatsby and Myrtle as sort of tragically similar characters is interesting. Both of them desperately looking to climb out of the lives they're in, both using relationships to do so, and both ultimately failing. So the kind of similarities in the way that their deaths are described, I think is fairly important. On that note about the sort of aftermath, we also have the kind of real bleakness and the very sad tone that is created by Fitzgerald when we have this realization that Gatsby really is alone, and he's alone so very much that Nick imagines this conversation. He says he imagines saying, "I'll get somebody for you, Gatsby. Don't worry, just trust me and I'll get somebody for you." And then imagining Gatsby's voice, "Look here, old sport, you've got to get somebody for me. You've got to try hard. I can't go through this alone." So we're seeing the sort of depths of the friendship here between Nick and Gatsby, certainly how much Nick felt for Gatsby, this need to make it better for him. It perhaps gives us a sort of insight into why Nick felt the need to write The Great Gatsby. It's almost finding a way to honor him where, he is not being honoured in death, certainly. Thought I'd show you this little bit as well. This is when Nick goes to visit Wolfsheim and is trying to convince him to come up to the funeral because he's so worried, as we saw before, that he desperately wants to get somebody for him. And so obviously he goes to Meyer Wolfsheim. Why wouldn't he? But what comes out of this conversation is a really interesting point about identity and the construction of identity. So according to Wolfsheim and his memories, he was a young major just out of the army, covered over with medals he got in the war. He was so hard up he had to keep on wearing his uniform because he couldn't buy regular clothes. He hadn't eaten anything for a couple of days, and then he ate more than $4 worth of food in half an hour. So this is the version of Jay Gatsby that has already met Daisy. This is the sort of the end of that part of the story. He's already been to war. He's already been decorated. He's had that position. He's had that status position, like going off to Oxford, etc. But he still has come out with nothing. So this is a point where he's got sort of half of himself, but not the money to go with it. But what I'm interested in is this. Start him. I made him. That's Wolfsheim. Yeah? Nick says, did you start him in business? Start him in business. I made him. Now the question is, I made him in business, or I made him? Is this a comment on the way that other people can shape and mold the identities of others? That is the case, and Wolfsheim, I think, is taking too much credit, because we know that Jay Gatsby, when he was James Gatz at the age of 17, lay awake and wrestled with this version of himself, and it's a product that, is actually quite similar. It was dreamed up by a 17-year-old. But it certainly gives us an indication of where some of that drive came from and that relationship. If there was any ambiguity about the connection between Wolfsheim and Gatsby, it is resolved for us there. In fact, Nick even wonders if Wolfsheim is about to admit that Gatsby had a part in the fixing of the World Series, which is not confirmed one way or the other. But ultimately, the end of this conversation leaves Nick with nothing more than he had at the beginning, because Wolfsheim is determined that he is not going to go to the funeral. Another kind of sign of that sort of shady connection. He doesn't want to be connected. So another bleak point to consider. This bit is, I love this little bit. This comes from the book that Henry Gatz, Gatsby's father, brings to show Nick. And again, just focusing on this idea of identity and construction of self. Wolfsheim claims that he made Gatsby, but look at the way that Gatsby has made himself. Okay, so even just these little details. So we've got the word schedule, so sense that is ordered. Look at the time stamping, the way that he plans out his life, and look at the versions of the schedule or the activities that he's going to do. Early start, there's exercise, there's work and studying, there's sports. But look at this. practice elocution, poise, and how to attain it. Gatsby is planning himself from this moment, all of those years ago. He decides that he must read one improving book or magazine per week, for example. So here we see a young man planning who he is going to be. Dan Cody adds to it. Wolfsheim adds to it. But actually, the notion of what J. Gatsby is constructed here. But the sad thing is regardless of that, it didn't really do him any good in the end, because ultimately, when it comes to his funeral, he is alone. And here we have that little passage that describes this moment of anxiety, waiting and waiting and waiting for more people. Nick begins to look involuntarily out of the windows for other cars. So that adverb of manner showing it's becoming almost compulsive, his desperate need for someone to arrive. And I just think the starkness of these sentences, particularly that simple sentence right at the end, simple declarative sentence, nobody came. Again, just reminding us that when it comes down to it, Gatsby is isolated. He was used. Now, I'm not saying that he is an innocent man, because Gatsby did his fair share of using as well, but there is something quite tragic in this moment at the end, that Nick is the only one there. With one exception, Owl Eyes. So if you remember chapter 3, Owl Eyes is the chap in the library that is really, really surprised when he's bringing down all of the books that they're real. He was expecting them to be fake. And I think this is really important, because throughout this book, you kind of get a sense, well, who actually knows Gatsby? Who really knows Gatsby? Possibly Nick, because Nick has had the benefit of Gatsby's truth, particularly from the previous chapter when it talks about how the identity of J. Gatsby is broken up like glass by Tom's hard malice, and in this moment he's willing to tell all truth. So Nick knows Gatsby because Gatsby has been most vulnerable with him. Owl Eyes knew him somehow from the outset, so it is fitting that Owl Eyes is there at the end. And just as Owl Eyes understood the situation way better than anybody else at the time, he also understands the situation here, because when he says I couldn't get to the house, he literally means I couldn't get there. And so when Nick says, well, yeah, nobody could, neither could anybody else, the shock that Owl Eyes has is particularly powerful. Why, my God, they used to go there by the hundreds. The poor son of a bitch. Again, it's that moment of clarity, that moment of understanding. Fitzgerald does want us to have empathy. He does want us to feel a sense of pathos for the way that Gatsby is treated in death. Nick is obviously very, very affected by Gatsby's death and by the build-up to Gatsby's death. And I think this is a really, really important moment where he talks about the way that his dreams are haunted, because they're so sort of reminiscent of moments of the novel. So he says, West Egg still figures in my more fantastic dreams. Fantastic here means like fantastical. So think back to like the Valley of Ashes, the Fantastic Farms. It doesn't mean great. It means of fantasy, unreal. He sees it as a night scene by El Greco. Google El Greco paintings, and even put in Gatsby, because there are people that have kind of married up these pictures, but it's so perfect for describing, for comparing this sort of gloom of Nick's dream. So do go and have a little look. 100 houses, at once conventional and grotesque. Sound like Gatsby's house, conventional, but sort of a facade. Crouching under a sullen, overhanging sky and a lustreless moon. Look at all of that imagery, that personification of the sky. Look at the way that there is this sort of ominous, foreboding tone here, with almost quite gothic features. In the foreground, 4 solemn men in dress suits are walking along the sidewalk with a stretcher, connotations of death, on which lies a drunken woman in a white evening dress. anyone from Gatsby's party, the recklessness, the drunkenness, those links between that and death. Her hand, which dangles over the side, another image of death, sparkles cold with jewels. Beautiful metaphor there. Perhaps a little bit of symbolism about the cold and motionless of the upper classes and the kind of materialistic gains of that time. Yes, she's bejeweled, she's sparkling, but it's cold. Gravely the men turn in at a house. The wrong house. No one knows the woman's name, no one cares. Could be Gatsby being described there, could be Myrtle being described there. There's a sort of incongruity with this wrong house. And of course it's a dream, yeah? It's Nick's dreams, but you can see how traumatized he is by everything that has happened. And that is why he decides to go back home, because the whole of this area is haunted for me. So that metaphor really suggests some trauma. Now I want you to think all the way back to chapter 1, right at the beginning, when Fitzgerald's giving us our lovely little narrative hooks. Yeah, he says in Nick's voice, "When I came back from the East last autumn, I felt that I wanted the world to be in uniform and at a sort of moral attention forever. I wanted no more excursions, riotous excursions with privileged glimpses into the human heart." So now we understand why back in chapter 1, he was so disturbed and he was looking for a kind of sense of moral order. He didn't want this kind of wildness and fun. He wanted the world to stand at moral attention, you know, to be doing the right thing at all times, where everything is predictable and right. It's because this is what he's been left with. So you're sort of coming full circle. You're sort of understanding where that sense of being, you know, so disturbed came from. So just as we're perhaps feeling quite a bit of empathy for Nick and how sad he is about the death of his friend and his desperate need to find some sort of order and put it all together, we're going to talk about him and Jordan. And I'm going to stop feeling quite so sorry for him, because I find this little passage at the end of the chapter and the end of the book so upsetting, but also so revealing about an aspect of Nick. And I am going to do a video on Nick's relationships, because I think there's plenty to look at. But he realizes that he does have to do one thing, an awkward, unpleasant thing that needs to be done. That awkward, unpleasant thing is, of course, officially breaking up with Jordan, because, you know, they've had the awful telephone call. They had the moment where he sort of just disappeared off, strangely feeling revolted by her presence after Myrtle's death. But look at the language that's used here. I wanted to leave things in order and not just trust that obliging and indifferent sea to sweep my refuse away. What a metaphor. So at best, the relationship is nothing more than refuse. At worst, what, Jordan is his refuse? Or it's not very nice. And just in case you weren't aware, refuse is quite an Americanism. It means rubbish. It means detritus, garbage, trash, to be American. Yeah, so that as a metaphor is quite harsh. He's like, oh, probably just shouldn't let it be swept away. I better clear up my mess myself. And so he meets up with Jordan. Oh, apologies, I said phone call before. That was in the previous chapter. So they meet up and they have this conversation. And he assumes that when she says that she's involved and perhaps engaged with another man, that she is lying, which suggests that he thinks quite highly of himself. And is also a reminder about the casual nature that he decided that she was incurably dishonest, but not to blame lying in women too deeply. I think Jordan hits the nail on the head here. Fitzgerald returns to this extended metaphor of cars and reckless or dangerous driving, an image that has been repeated so many times throughout the novel. She says, "Do you remember a conversation we had once about driving a car? You said a bad driver was only safe until she met another bad driver. Well, I met another bad driver, didn't I? I mean, it was careless of me to make such a wrong guess. I thought you were rather an honest, straightforward person. I thought it was your secret pride." Jordan and Nick have made assumptions about each other. Jordan made an assumption that he was honest and straightforward, and the suggestion now that she's saying that he is metaphorically a bad driver would hint to the fact that she no longer sees him as honest and straightforward. Nick has spent the entire novel saying that Jordan is emotionless and cold, and that's one of the reasons he finds her so attractive. It's because everything she does and says is scornful, and she's not the kind of woman to sort of carry dreams around with her. He sees her as completely two-dimensional, so he hasn't considered the idea that his behaviour might hurt her. So that's poignant enough, what Jordan says about the cars, that they're actually both bad drivers, and so neither one of them is safe. Nick's response: I'm 30, I said. I'm 5 years too old to lie to myself and call it honour. Now, what does he mean? What would he need to lie about and call it honour? In relationships, when did honour and lies come together? I think that Fitzgerald is sneakily telling us here, through Nick being a bit unreliable and vague, that he and Jordan have had extramarital relations. Think about back to that chapter, when he gets back and it's like 2, 3 in the morning he's been with her. It sounds to me like he and Jordan have had sex. Now, we are in the 1920s. That is not a normal thing, that is scandalous. And so when she says, you've thrown me over, the suggestion is that she was expecting something to come from this relationship. And Nick says, I'm too old for this. I'm not going to lie. I'm not going to pretend to want to be with you and wrap it up as honour. That is quite cold. Here we have an example where his misunderstanding of her as a person, i.e., or his discounting her as a person, has led him to behave in a way that is really quite scandalous. Some of you might want to consider why he seems to be interested in a woman that in his mind is disinterested. Does it speak to issues with commitment, for example? I mean, we can't escape the fact that when in the previous chapters, when he was looking to the future, he saw it as a kind of lonely future of being a single man with thinning hair. You've got that beautiful T.S. Eliot Prufrock reference there, but like this line of men with suitcases. There is a suggestion that he sees himself as being alone. Another perhaps opportunity to consider Nick's sexuality. I think this is relevant here, that he involves himself with women that he feels have no future. That may be somewhere that you might want to explore. You can disagree with me. Tell me in the comments. Tell me what you think. If we were feeling a little bit like, ugh, about Nick, we're going to get a little bit like, we're going to feel a bit better about him, because of course we need to talk about his last meeting with Tom Buchanan, because he bumps into him. Notice the storytelling is back. One late afternoon in October, I saw Tom Buchanan. Tom is exactly the same as he always is. Aggressive, his head moving sharply. Note that little adverb of manner there. His restless eyes, another typical adjective to describe Tom. Strong, big, suspicious, in the way. And what's he doing? Of course, he's shopping for jewellery. What else would he be doing? Now, there is a kind of obliviousness to Tom's response here. It's almost like he can't quite work out why Nick might not want to shake hands with him. But Nick explains to us, the audience, what the issue is. And, this is such a powerful quote. I will just point out that in the ellipsis, the stuff that I've missed out is the discussion of whether or not he told Wilson about Gatsby. And that is worth having a little look at, especially if you want to raise a question about how much Tom knows about Myrtle's death, because it is quite ambiguous as to what he knows about Daisy's involvement or not. But regardless, Nick comes to this conclusion. It was all very careless and confused. They were careless people, Tom and Daisy. They smashed up things and creatures and then retreated back into their money or their vast carelessness or whatever it was that kept them together. and let other people clean up the mess they had made. What a criticism. They were careless people. So note the adjective repetition there with careless. Note the verb choice. They smashed up. Okay, so this total oblivious destruction. They ruin everything around them, but it's carelessness. It's not necessarily vindictive. This is interesting. They smashed up things and creatures. Things and creatures, not people. There's a kind of universality of what they smash up. But things and creatures, I think, is quite an interesting placement, because I think there's quite a nice focus on things, and again the vagueness of that all. They retreat back, so notice there's judgment in that verb, and again that sort of suggestion of obliviousness, into their money, which solves everything, or their vast carelessness. Note again, we've now got carelessness as an abstract noun compared to those adjectives, and it is pre-modified by the adjective vast, again suggesting this huge expanse of carelessness. Their carelessness knows no bound, or whatever it was that kept them together. Note the vagueness, okay, of this interrogative pronoun. And then they let other people clean up the mess that they had made. And this is a perfect description in some ways of everything that has happened. Particularly with Gatsby. Such a brilliant quote, especially if you were talking about kind of class divide and the idea of the upper classes, the higher classes, having a disregard and a kind of oblivious disregard to the people around them. This is obviously really, really helpful. So he shakes hands with him because it seems silly not to. Tom goes into the jewelry store to buy a pearl necklace. Pearl necklace. Remember, pearls or paper? Daisy chose pearls. It's a little kind of doffing the cap to the relationship between Tom and Daisy there. And he does, in parenthesis, say, or perhaps only a pair of cuff buttons. So he's like, you know, maybe he's out there buying the next present for Daisy, you know, to keep her on track. Or maybe just fancy some cufflinks. There's a kind of casual tone there in that parenthesis. It is like, could just be that conspicuous consumption. But most importantly, he's rid of Nick's provincial squeamishness forever, almost like Tom would look down and go, sort of think, oh dear, look at you with all of your silly morals and scruples, how very provincial. So we get a little closed box around there. The only thing that isn't closed, of course, is, are Tom and Daisy happy? Just, you know, how much does Tom know? We don't know. It's left open. And here we have the final moment in the book that needs a little look. I want to first draw your attention to this moment, his last night. He goes back to Gatsby's house, to that huge, incoherent failure of a house once more. Look at that metaphor and personification. It's an incoherent failure, incoherence, not making sense, having no clarity. And as we know that the house is a symbol for Gatsby and Gatsby's identity, and that is a failure. One, because he's dead, and two, because his sense of self, of who J. Gatsby was, had been destroyed by the end of his life. And it is it's incoherent failure because nothing about it quite makes sense. What's interesting though is on those white steps, so think about that idea of that facade, that look, that shiny bright newness, there is an obscene word scrawled by some boy with a piece of brick, which is obviously to do with the scandal, but there's this idea of like corrupting what was once there, what seems pure, what seems white. And Nick, in a moment of perfection in terms of symbolism on Fitzgerald's part, erases it, drawing my shoe raspingly along the stone. Nick erases the scrawl from Gatsby's house, with Gatsby's house representing his identity. What is this book called? The Great Gatsby. Yeah, as in Nick is erasing the kind of the nastier bits of Gatsby, and he is making him great. It's like a metaphor for the process of him writing about Gatsby. He's rewriting his narrative, making him great. He's getting rid of the scrolls. I think it's marvelous. And then he starts to reflect on the world that they're in and the moment that people discovered it, and this kind of, it's all about the sense of new life and hope. And he imagines Gatsby's wonder when he first picked out the green light at the end of Daisy's dock. He'd come a long way to this blue lawn, and his dream must have seemed so close that he could hardly fail to grasp it. He did not know that it was already behind him, somewhere back in that vast obscurity beyond the city, where the dark fields of the Republic rolled on under the night. So this bit here is saying about how when he's imagining Gatsby looking, you know, hand out, trembling for the green light, which of course symbolises his desire, his want for Daisy, for the position that Daisy creates, for being the person that he always imagined himself being. Nick is saying, it was never there. It was never ahead of him. It was always behind. Gatsby was always striving for something that was in the past and was never going to happen again. So the dream was dead before he began to dream it again. So bleak. Sorry, the end of this book is so bleak. And then that idea is reiterated in the final, in this final moment. Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgastic future that year by year recedes before us. It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms further, and one fine morning. And so we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. Oh, there's so much to talk about. So, you know, he believes in the green light. He believes in an orgastic future, this kind of future of hope. Okay, but notice, right, it starts off Gatsby, singular, proper noun, and then it moves to inclusive, third person, year by year, that recedes before us. So now we are included. It eluded us then, but that's no matter. So we are part of this failed dream. We have the same failed dreams. That's no matter. And you get this hyphen. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms further. So we are echoing Gatsby. So he's not now just talking about Gatsby, he's talking about mankind. He's talking about our desires for more, yeah, to better ourselves, to climb socially, to find love. And so we're going to do these same things. Note the comparative adjectives: faster, further, ... and one fine morning. Storytelling again. Now, you're probably looking at this and thinking, wow, that is really, really disjointed. This is actually called aposiopesis. I'm not 100% certain if that's how you say it. It might be aposiopesis, but aposiopesis, which is basically when you've got a sort of sudden interruption or break in a line of narrative or dialogue that seems sort of incongruous. And we've got it here. In fact, we have it twice. We have it created here in this ellipsis, where it then moves to "and one fine morning." Note the kind of storytelling tone that is created there, like you're starting a new story. It's another moment of hope. And then we've got another example of aposiopesis here, where it's suddenly interrupted, like breaking off the story. So what's Fitzgerald up to? Well, he's being quite crafty as always, because we get this idea of looking towards the future, creating a sense of hope, and then cutting it off. Again, reminding us that dreams don't come true, that the American dream is never going to happen, or it's never going to succeed in quite the way. It's another bleak moment about things not coming to fruition, just like it happened for Gatsby. But at the same time, so we beat on, boats against the current. So look at that metaphor. It's this idea about this is what humans do. We keep on trying, we keep on hoping, going, even when it's hard, boats against the current. Also, you know, you've got that hardship and that struggle in that metaphor. So we beat on. Again, look, we're still in first person plural. It's all of us. It's mankind that behave like this. But we are still borne back ceaselessly into the past. We're always sort of going back to a particular point. We're never kind of learning from it, perhaps. It's a really, really sad end to this book, where dreams don't come true, and it ends with this really kind of bleak message about what the future holds. And that's why some people thought that people forget that this was written in the early 20s. They think, oh well, this must have been after the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression, and it's not. It's in early 20s, right in the kind of the boom, the roaring 20s. So perhaps Fitzgerald just had a kind of more of idea of what was in store than others. My goodness, I cannot believe it. That was our last chapter of the Great Gatsby analysis. So thank you so much for sticking with me. If you've watched all of the series from the beginning, if you're just nipping into this one, do go back and have a look. There's also audiobook version of each chapter as well. Do look out for some more stuff coming your way on Gatsby. I'm going to do some work on character and theme. And if you study Edexcel, you might be interested to know that I'm going to do some comparisons between Gatsby and Shakespeare's Othello. That might sound mental to those of you not doing the Edexcel Langlet spec, but it's a really interesting comparison. So do just come and have a look, and hopefully you'll find something interesting. That's it from me. Thank you so much for watching. Happy revising.